project lead of the Route to Food initiative. And today I want to welcome you to the second episode in a three-part series about pesticides in Kenya. Last week, we looked at some data from sampling studies we've done in counties around the country. And today we're going to learn a little bit more about the registration process in Kenya, so we can understand how pesticides arrive in our agricultural system. We know last year that this topic of pesticides was quite hotly debated after a petition was tabled in Parliament, which called for the withdrawal of certain active ingredients from the Kenyan market. The prayer of this petition wasn't to ban all pesticides in the country, but rather to withdraw the certain ones that were shortlisted that have the most harmful human health and environmental effects. And in response to the recommendations made by the National Assembly, the Pests Control Products Board have created or formed a task force to review some of the active ingredients that are registered, with the view to really removing those that might be harmful to us. So we have 15 minutes today, an hour and 15 minutes, not 15 minutes, we have an hour and 15 minutes today. We're going to have, we will listen to 3 speakers, each for 15 minutes each, and then I'm going to open for discussion and Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Ngaruiya, who is a registration officer for some years at the Pest Control Product Board. Dr. Ngaruiya, are you there? Can you turn on your video so that we can see you, please? After Dr. Ngaruiya, we will invite Dr. Bollmohr, who is an ecotoxicologist and has spent more than 10 years working on issues of pesticides on the continent. So welcome, Dr. Bollmohr. And then finally, Urhahn will present findings of a study done by Rosa Luxemborg Foundation, Pesticide Action Network, and Nkota on double standards in the pesticides trade. If you have any questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A function. If there is something that you would like to say during the plenary, feel free to just raise your digital hand, and then I can allow you to speak or give your comments. And yeah, you'd be welcome to do that. So let me hand over now first to Dr. Ngaruiya. Welcome, thank you for being with us today. And you have 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Lida, for this opportunity. Can I share my slides? I have a few slides to present here.
Yes.
I hope you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can. Yes.
All right, thank you. I'm going to give a brief presentation on the registration of pest control products in Kenya. As Aurora said, I've been in registration of products for more than 10 years, but I'm currently in charge of research, strategy, and planning within the Pest Control Products Board. Now, in my presentation, I'll give a brief introduction, overview of registration procedures, both for the conventional and biopesticides, and a bit about banning of pest control products. So for those who may not be familiar with the Pest Control Products Board, PCPB is a regulatory agency that was established way back in 1985 after the enactment of the Pest Control Products Act, Cap 346, laws of Kenya, way back in 1982. So this act has been amended once in order to incorporate issues to do with the counterfeiting. And if you look at the act, the main reason why this board was established was to regulate the importation, exportation, manufacture, distribution, sale and use of pest control products in Kenya. Now, if you look at Section 4 of the Act, it states that no person shall import into Kenya or sell any pest control product unless that product has been registered packaged and labeled in accordance with the Act and regulations that are made thereunder. So the key word here for the purpose of today's seminar is the product has to be registered. We look at a wide range of products that are regulated under the Act. They are products that are for use in agriculture, like the herbicides, the fungicides, the insecticides. And then we also have products that are for use in public health, like for control of cockroaches, rodents, products that are incorporated in mosquito nets for repelling or for control of mosquitoes. Until 2018, we used to regulate animal health products like acaricides. And there was a new body that was established by the name Veterinary Medicines Directorate that is now currently regulating issues to do with animal health products. So why do we regulate pesticides? Our understanding is that it is not just in Kenya where the importance of regulating pesticides has been acknowledged. If you look at many other countries, they have formed regulatory bodies. In China, for instance, we have ICAMA. We are aware US is EPA. In UK, the CRD. In Canada, we have the Pest Management Regulatory Authority. And all of them aim at ensuring safety of the plants, animals, and also the environment, of course, the citizens also. And the FAO also emphasizes on the need for various governments to ensure safety to citizens, animals, plants, and the environment. So we know that if you are to use pesticides to manage pests, they are also associated with some hazardous effects. Like, for instance, some may be flammable, some may have some negative health effects, others may affect the environment, and that's the reason why they have to be regulated. But although they have these negative effects, potential negative effects, there is need to use them, because in this region, if you try to grow any commercial crop without use of a pesticide, you get very low yield, and therefore farmers somehow have to use them. We do not require to use pesticides because we want to use them. It is because there is a need, particularly for us growing crops in the tropics, where the environment is good for both crop production and also for the pests to proliferate. It's critical because most of the pesticides that we use in Kenya are not manufactured locally, they are manufactured overseas, and therefore we have to have a local agent appointed to represent the manufacturer from overseas. Then there's a submission of the application coupled with the full technical dossier. And this dossier has details, for instance, in terms of the profiles, toxicology, ecotoxicology of the product. And then we require the summary dossier to be submitted together. We require a sample of the analytical grade of the product. We require the proposed label. And the certificate of registration is very key as evidence that that product is already approved by the relevant regulatory body in that country. And we also require the agreement between the manufacturer overseas, the exporter, and the local agent. So the dossier that is to be submitted has to have a number of key information or data. As I said, we require evidence of registration in the country of origin. We require physical chemical properties of the product, the toxicological profile, ecotoxicological profile, how the product behaves in the environment, that is in water, in soil.
Sorry,
Yes.
you broke up, Dr. Ngaruiya. Could you just start from this slide again?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, yes.
All right, I said as part of the data that we require for registration is evidence of that product in the country of origin by way of having a certificate. Then we require physical chemical properties of the product, the toxicological profile. Then we have the ecotoxicological product of the product. Then we have behavior of that product in the environment, that is in air, water, and also in the soil. We also require biological efficacy data. When the dossier is submitted to PCPB, in the first step, we conduct completeness check. That is basically checking whether all the information that is required has been submitted. If we are satisfied with the information, then usually that product is allowed to go for local biological efficacy trials where we give an experimental permit. Occasionally, we may require other bridging studies, like maybe we have some deficiencies in terms of toxicological data on the formulated product or physical chemical properties, where we refer this application to the relevant institution that is accredited to do this kind of work locally. Now, this is normally carried out by institutions that have been accredited by the board, that is for bridging studies and efficacy. And currently we have 62 institutions that have been accredited to be doing this kind of work. For instance, if you look at pineapples, most pineapple trials are done at Del Monte, which we recognize as the samples of these products are normally delivered to PCPB, and then PCPB transmits that sample to the relevant testing institution. We also take a sample to our laboratory where we do formulation analysis just to confirm that the product that is being tested is the same. And then it is sent for efficacy testing. This is just an example of one of the trial sites where a product was being tested on roses. On the right, you can see one of our officers who is being involved in the evaluation of the product. Now, after the completion of the biological efficacy trials, the testing institution submits the report to PCPB, and the applicant also updates the label, the commercial label, indicating clearly the application rates, the timing of application, as it has been recommended by the testing institution locally. And if there is need to have mitigation measures, they are also included on the label. Then after that, the full package of the data is evaluated by PCPB. This now includes the efficacy, consumer safety, the toxicological data, ecotox, physical chemical properties, behavior in the environment. So all of them are evaluated by our technical staff. And thereafter, it is discussed in the technical and registration committee of the board. Then the technical and registration committee of the board may approve and therefore recommend to the board, or they may make some variations, or they even may reject an application. So then that is submitted to the Board of Management, which then registers a product for 3 years, and it can be renewed for 2 years thereafter, and a certificate of registration is usually issued. Currently, we have slightly over 2,000. One technical grade materials, and then the temporary ones that are registered. Now, apart from the conventional chemicals, we also have biopesticides, and we recognize 3 categories of biopesticides. We have the microbials. These are things like bacteria, viruses, fungi. Then we have macrobials, and these include things like the nematodes. We have things like phytoceras, the large organisms, things like the predators, parasitoids. And then we have the biochemicals. These are products that are derived from living things like plant extracts. And recognizing the difference between the various groups of biopesticides, we as PCPB came up with the different guidelines, which are in Form A1. For various types of biochemicals, where A3A is for semiochemicals for monitoring and control, and the requirements for registration are relatively less compared with the conventional chemicals. Then we have the Form A3B, which is for monitoring purposes for straight-chain Lepidoptera and pheromones, products, for instance, for monitoring for armyworm or tutor, etc. Then we also recognize that when it comes to biopesticides, they are relatively considered to be safer than the conventional chemicals, and therefore we use the tiered approach when it comes to data, where we have the tox and ecotoxicological. The other tiers are provided only if there are concerns at that tier 1 for toxicology and ecotoxicology. And then we also have waivers. For instance, if a biopesticide is based on a food grade material, then we have less data required for registration. And currently we have 109 products that are based on biopesticides registered for use in Kenya. Now, once a product is registered for any use in Kenya, an applicant may apply for label extension, and this is only applicable for products that are registered for one use or another in this country, where in this case, 2 efficacy seasons data has to be submitted for it to be considered. And then for residue, if it's a product that's going to be used on edible crops, we require either residue data generated on the respective product or submission of the JMPI evaluation report that is also acceptable, which we can use for making a decision. But as we use the JMPI report, there's need to ensure that the GAP that is used in Kenya or recommended for use in Kenya is consistent with the GAP that is being used or recommended through the joint meeting on pesticide residues. Then we also require a copy of the new label for label extension and the proposed maximum residue limits and the PHI for edible crops. Then once a product is registered, the issues to do with hazards associated with that product require to be communicated, and we normally communicate that through the workshops, shows, media, but the main tool of communication between the manufacturer and the users is through the label. So we have labeling regulations as provided in legal notice number 89 of 1984 and also 127 of 2006. And one critical provision in this regulation is that no product can be sold in Kenya without a label, and all the labels have to be approved by the board. This is to ensure that the information that is being provided by the manufacturer is what is in our dossiers, and it's based on the evaluation that we did at PCPB. All Kenya labels have to be both in English and Kiswahili to ensure adequate communication. And we also use the WHO color codes also to communicate on the hazards. So as an example of a product that's registered for use in Kenya, we have the PCPB number as indicated. Like in this case, it's PCPB-CR. That means fully registered. And I thought maybe I should also share the color code. You can see like this product is under WHO class 2, which has a yellow color band. And on the left, you can see there are pictograms indicating that the product should be stored away and should be locked away from children. And this appears on all Kenyan labels. And then on the left again, we have pictograms related to how to mix the product, what kind of protective gear one requires to put on. And then on the right side, we have pictograms related to the time of application of a product or application may be spraying, the kind of gear one is supposed to put on. And then lastly, we have after use, one should ensure that they wash their hands and also protect the environment. So this is just an example, but there are many other color codes that are used in Kenya. We have the red for highly toxic products, then we have yellow for moderate ones, then blue, and then finally green. But we are currently planning to move to GHS, but for now we are using the WHO classification. Now, apart from registering products, the board is also empowered to suspend or revoke a certificate of registration under a number of conditions, and I've picked a few of them. Like for instance, if the dossier was submitted and later on we realized that the application was false, or there is new information that shows that the product is no longer safe based on the new information, or the premises where the product is being formulated or stored is not suitable, or there's a change of but the decision made by the board is not final. The applicant can still apply to the minister for an appeal, and then if a decision is made by the minister or the cabinet secretary, that decision is final. Then when it comes to international issues related to registered products, PCPB is the national designated authority when it comes to international conventions on pesticides. And I've picked a few where Kenya is a signatory. We are a signatory to the Rotterdam Convention on prior informed consent procedures on certain hazardous chemicals and pesticide formulations. This is where if a product has been found to have serious effects on human health or the environment, then it is discussed by the Chemical Review Committee, which is under the Rotterdam Convention. And then after discussion, the whole world actually looks at it, and if it's in agreement that a product should be banned, then it's listed under Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention. Or if a product is severely hazardous, again, it's listed there, and then countries are allowed to make individual decisions, but the convention generally guides. Then we have the Montreal Protocol, which deals with ozone-depleting substances. You are aware that methyl bromide is one of the products that have been in use for quite some time, and it is listed in this Montreal Protocol. Then you have the Basel Convention, which deals with the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Again, Kenya is a signatory. Then we have the Stockholm Convention, which deals with persistent organic pollutants. And then the most recent one is the Minamata Convention on mercury. This is for products that contain mercury. Then based on these conventions, we have banned 40 pest control products for use in Kenya. And the list of banned products is available on our website. So I've picked a few of them that are appearing on our website. Maybe if I pick the most recent ones, you can see Dicofor was banned for it in 2020, and the list goes on. So we have 40 products that are I think I want to stop there. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a few of our colleagues who also deal with the registration of products. So maybe when you'll be asking questions, Laura, you may allow my colleagues also to make a comment. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Ngaruiya. Just so long as, like I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone wants to add a comment or have a question, please just raise your hand in the chat. Thank you very much, though, Dr. Ngaruiya. Maybe that was the shortest government presentation of all history. It was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would just like to invite Dr. Bollmohr now to speak a bit more about the registration process in the EU. Thank you. You can just unmute yourself when you're ready, Silke.
Yes, so thank you. I just would like to highlight a couple of things from the European point of view in terms of pesticide registration, and looking more critically a little bit behind the scene of the registration of pesticides, just to reflect a little bit that it's not necessarily the fact that pesticides are safe just because they're registered somewhere else. And apart from that, pesticides are never safe per se, because they are developed to be toxic and we intentionally bring them out into the environment. So I just want to highlight a couple of things specifically in context to the Kenyan regulation and to the Kenyan context. So the number of pesticides or the amount of pesticides being imported in Kenya is more than tripled from 2015 to 2018. These data are from the Agrochemical Association of Kenya. And it shows that herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides are drastically increasing. So we need to make sure that these pesticides are safe for the environment and for human health. And why am I focusing on Europe? Well, when we looked at, we did this report for Route to Food, or together with Route to Food, when we looked at the companies behind the registration of these increasing pesticides, we found out that Europe is actually playing quite a big role in this. So most of the pesticides are basically coming from China, but also many of the products are actually registered by companies sitting in Europe. So the most important regulation in Europe is basically the regulation 1107 from 2009, which came into force in 2011. And this is quite important to know the date, because now we are in 2021, and pesticides normally registered for 10 years roughly in Europe. And that means that many pesticides going through a re-registration process now in Europe, and maybe also facing a phase out in Europe, which might also reflect on the Kenyan situation in terms of export, etc. And this regulation is quite sophisticated. So it requires a lot of different tests. We already heard what type of tests are required. And normally the risk assessment, and it very clearly stipulates or states that the risk assessment should be independent, it should be objective and transparent. The risk assessment should also be use the most current scientific and technical knowledge. It should definitely ensure the protection of both human and animal health and the environment. And it should be underpinned by the precautionary principle. So what does that mean, precautionary principle? Well, if we're not sure if a pesticide is causing an effect, like, for example, effect on reproduction or very toxic to bees, then the uncertainty jumps in, and we rather take the precautionary principle saying we're not registering this pesticide unless the industry or the registrar or the company who wants to register the pesticide is providing evidence that this pesticide is not actually causing an effect. Now, I said already, if someone wants to register a pesticide, like the industry, then they need to provide a dossier, which we heard already, and this needs to entail lots of different tests, like on residues, on behavior of the pesticide in the environment, ecotox tests, tox tests, etc. So this is really quite a sophisticated process, and a very long process, and a very expensive process as well. But nevertheless, there are gaps, which I would like to highlight a little bit, which might be important for the Kenyan situation. So when one is looking at the registration of a pesticide, one looks on the one hand on the exposure. So how much pesticide is in the environment or in us, or how are we exposed to the pesticide? And in this case, it just shows you that even if you apply a pesticide on a field, the pesticide might move in the environment. So it might evaporate into the air, it might move into this river, the surface water, into the groundwater, etc. And if we talk about us, then also we can be exposed in different ways. Like the farmer, the sprayer, the operator can get exposed through skin, through lungs, inhaling. We also as consumers can be exposed through consuming crops which have high levels or levels of pesticides. So this is all the exposure of pesticides. And then one looks at the effect. And the effect of pesticides is then also taking into consideration lots of different species and also lots of different levels within a species. And this slide just reflects, you can look at the DNA, the effect of pesticides on DNA, on organs, on the individual level, on population level, and you can even go higher and higher in this level of ecosystem. But as higher you go, as more complex it will be. And most of the time, the effect on humans are extrapolated from a lower level DNA or up to a level, most of the time, tests with mice or with rats. Now, what is the assessor, the registration body then doing? They basically compare these two, like the exposure and the effect with each other. So this is like very much simplified. It's more complex, but 15 minutes are not enough to explain this complex risk assessment procedure. But in the lower tiers, in the more simple risk assessment, this is basically the case. So what are you doing? You're basically comparing the concentration in the pesticide in the environment with an effect on something. So for example, the calculated pesticide concentration in a river, and then you compare that with an effect value on a fish living in that river. And if this value is below 1, then you consider this pesticide to be safe and it can be registered. If it's higher than 1, then you require more studies, then the precautionary principle comes in, so the industry needs to provide more studies. And generally what one is trying to do is one is trying to decrease the exposure level. And this is now very complicated, but I really try to simplify that as much as possible. How can you then basically decrease the exposure concentration? Very often by implementing mitigation measures. So if we come back to the example with the river, for example, if the value is higher than 1, then mitigation measures jump into place, like, for example, a 20-meter buffer zone, as it is the case with bifenthrin, is registered in Europe only under this mitigation measure, but many farmers in Kenya using it without the mitigation measure, either because they don't know about it, or it's not applicable at all because the farmer's land is not even 20 meters. So this is very important to keep in mind. Now, in the beginning, I said the regulation stipulates that the decision process should ensure a high level of protection. If we now look at the exposure, one might argue that the environment in Kenya might be different. So in Europe, one takes a standard water body, a standard soil according to the different areas in Europe and temperature, but maybe it might be different in Kenya. And this you might have a big impact on the outcome of your evaluation. Then also farmers' behavior or misbehavior is neglected as possible input. Last week, we reflected on that many farmers don't know how to use the pesticides. So this whole misbehavior is not actually reflected in the exposure assessment. Metabolites, breakdown products of pesticides in the lower tiers, not implemented at all. And very, very important that all these mitigation measures under which many of the pesticides in Europe are registered are not implementable in many countries of the global south, and Kenya is part of it. As we saw last week, 30% of the farmers we interviewed not able to wear any protection clothes. If we now look at the effect, the European legislation says the decision process should be in the light of current scientific and technical knowledge. Gaps again. Some of the tests are partly outdated. Old tests, like there are much more sophisticated tests available, which are not in place yet. Then for the Kenyan context, normally in Europe or in America, wherever you take the legislation from, the test species are more normally species which are occurring in that area, but not necessarily in Kenya. So a test on bees will be done for European honeybees or bumblebees, but not necessarily the Kenyan stingless bee, which is very important for pollination processes in Kenya. We don't know the effect of neonicotinoids on stingless bees. There is still a huge gap on low dose effects, like all these endocrine disrupting chemicals. They act on a very low level, and they're not really tests available to reflect on this. And very important for the environmental assessment, fungicides are not considered. So there are no tests on fungicides. And Kenya is using a lot of fungicides because we have 2 rainy seasons and we're facing a lot of fungal problems. So farmers using a lot of fungicides like carbendazim, for example, but there is a huge gap of knowledge on assessing this on the ecosystem. We don't know. And mixture toxicity, we saw last week, tomatoes with 10 different pesticides, we don't know the effect yet. So gaps in the effect. And then I also in the beginning, I said the decision process should be underpinned by the precautionary principle, as it is said by the EU regulation. But most of the time, the benefits taking in consideration. I mean, we hear that in Kenya now with the communication channels from the industry saying, if we're not using this pesticide, the crops will die, we have less harvest, etc., etc. So we only look at the benefits, but what are actually the costs to human beings? What is the cost to a farmer needing to go to a doctor and get treatment for poisoning or anything like being exposed to a pesticide? What are the costs to the environment? They are not really considered, especially in countries like Kenya. The costs might be higher because people and environment are exposed in a higher way. Then there's no monitoring ongoing, at least environmental monitoring in Kenya. So we can't really compare, does the risk assessment and the registration actually works compared to what is actually going on in the environment. Label information, we saw what the label in the previous presentation, we saw the label instructions, but where are the labels for genders? How often do we see women on tomato fields collecting or harvesting tomatoes just after spraying with fungicides? If there's an effect on reproduction or unborn babies, maybe this needs to be reflected on the label. Where are the labels for effects on pollinators, toxicity, etc.? Then the old story, waste management, old bottles is not covered, especially for the Kenyan context and many, many other countries in the global south. And very important is when we look at efficacy done by the regulation, then it's on the crop itself to apply to determine the application rate and the frequency, but not necessarily the environmental impact. Now, the two last slides, I just want to show you the whole process in Europe and show you that even this whole process of registration is not very transparent and very open. First of all, the industry needs to prepare a dossier, and this dossier is then submitted to 1 or 2 member states in the EU. Now, first of all, the industry itself prepares the dossier, so it's doing all the tests. Then the industry can also select a member state. And the member states can be very different in terms of their pro or contra in terms of pesticides. Then this member state is then evaluating and producing a draft assessment report. This draft assessment report will then be submitted to the European Food Safety Authority. They will review it, and then it will go towards the European Commission, and they will either allow the pesticide or not allow the pesticide on EU level. Now, as I said already, is the registration process in Europe really independent, objective, and transparent? The industry selects the member states. The industry does its own safety testing and is also heavily involved in designing the methods for the risk assessment. So they're sitting on all the boards, and the dossier data, like all the data which is actually being submitted, are not openly available to the public. Now, way forward, maybe there should be locally adapted exposure and effect assessments for Kenya, where it's needed. And we all know these tests are very expensive, but because industry is supplying the data already in other continents or countries for additional tests needed to be done, why not in countries like Kenya as well, if the Kenyan authority says, well, we need additional tests for stingless bees, for example. So it's a responsibility maybe of the industry to do these tests and to provide these data. And the decision-making should definitely consider the fact that some of the mitigation measures are not applicable in Kenya at all. And the decision-making process should be supported by a pool of independent scientists. So these scientists should be really proven to be independent, not having any ties to industry or government or anything. And there generally needs to be an effort to move towards less toxic pesticides or even no pesticides, maybe through incentives for farmers converting to more sustainable farming techniques, to also provide more export opportunities to Europe, in the highlight that more and more pesticides will probably be phased out. Okay, so I hope it wasn't too complicated and it wasn't too much in these 15 minutes. And I hand over back to Laila.
Yeah, thank you very much, Silke. So I think we see there's a lot of subjectivity in the process along the way, which means that there's room to question, I guess, how reliable decisions are in other countries, and really the need for us to consider how we can adapt and respond in our context. So thank you very much. Very good. 15 minutes as well. A lot of data, a lot of information, but super good. And I just want to hand over now to our colleague from Rosa Luxemborg Foundation. Jan is speaking to us from Johannesburg, a very cold Johannesburg in South Africa, and is going to present the findings of a study that Rosa Luxemborg has done on double standards in international pesticides trade. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be with you. It was very interesting to listen to the previous speakers. And as you have pointed out, I'm working with an organization which is called Rosa Luxemborg Stiftung. This organization is associated with the Left Party in Germany, but independent. And the organization is running, how many? 25 offices across the globe for the African continent. And I'm responsible for the Food and Agriculture Program. And as you can imagine, yes, we work on pesticides, but we also work on other issues such as seed, green revolution, farm workers' rights, and so on. The topic today, or what I'm talking about, is a little bit different to the previous speakers. I'm talking about the topic of double standards in the international trade with pesticides and also with active ingredients. So what do I mean when I talk, or maybe one more remark. So what I'm presenting today is basically based on a publication, on a study that was released only a couple of weeks ago. The study has the title Double Standards in Hazardous Pesticides from Bayer and BASF, two German companies, and it was released by Rosa Luxemborg Stiftung, the Pesticide Action Networks in Germany, and in Guter Netzwerk in April this year. And my perspective today, talking as someone representing a German organization, is pretty much a German and also European Union perspective, and the impacts of exporting highly hazardous pesticides and also active ingredients to other parts of the world than Germany or the European Union. So talking about double standards, how do we define double standards in the pesticide trade? It is about pesticide products and also active ingredients that are either banned or not approved, that's a difference, in the European Union due to certain reasons. It's either health or environmental concerns, but that are nevertheless exported out of the European Union by big, usually agribusiness, agrochemical companies, and then sold in other regions of the world, most of all in the so-called global south. And this also includes the trade of pesticides and active ingredients that might be developed by these European corporations, but which these corporations then manufacture outside of the European Union, for instance, and sell throughout the world. And among others, those are the active ingredients and pesticides of Bayer and BASF. Maybe some, let's say, basic facts and figures when talking about double standards. So Bayer and BASF, as like 2 out of the 3 biggest agrochemical companies worldwide, they benefit in many, many circumstances from much weaker regulations in the global south than in Europe, for instance. And Silke has already pointed out that not everything is, perfect in the European Union, and that there are a lot of loopholes and also a lot of, opportunities when industries can try to do advocacy work in order to get the application process for their pesticides and active ingredients through. But most of these active ingredients, and I'm talking about highly toxic active ingredients, they are threatening the human health in the global south. And only a few months ago, maybe 7 or 8 months ago, there was a new study released, and the main finding of this study was or is that worldwide 385 million unintended acute pesticide poisonings we observe every year. That's almost half of the entire worldwide population working in agriculture. And there is always this argument. Sometimes it's the authorities, but also in many cases it's the companies themselves. They always claim, as long as you follow the rules and as long as you follow whatever is written on the label, then our pesticides and our active ingredients, they're safe for use. But from my perspective, the safe application of toxic pesticides in many circumstances in the global south is nothing more than just a myth or an illusion. And what I would say, what we rather observe is a violation of their due diligence obligations in terms of human rights by these huge agrochemical companies such as Bayer and BASF and others. I said I would present the main findings of our report that was released in April. So what we did, or there are various criteria for classifying whether a pesticide or an active ingredient is hazardous for either the environment or toxic for human health. We used the categorization of the World Health Organization, so the WHO, and it is very important. And this gives us sort of a glimpse whether an active ingredient is toxic for human health. And the WHO usually classifies active ingredients into two main categories. One is WHO Class 1A, and the other one is Class 1B. And these active ingredients in these two classes, they have an acute lethal effect on humans. So 1A is 5 milligram per kilogram of body weight. And class 1B is between 5 and 50 milligram per kilogram of body weight. That might be a lot, but it's not. Let's say an average person maybe has a weight of 70 kilograms. Then the amount which has like lethal consequences for a human being is less than a teaspoon of sugar, for instance. For our work, we also used a different categorization, which is the one by the European Union. They also, and this is maybe a little bit confusing because they also have the specification of 1A and 1B, but it's different to the WHO classification. And according to the European Union, category 1A are active ingredients that are proven to be harmful to humans, and category 1B, they are likely to be harmful to humans. And what they usually define are long-term impacts or effects, and they are called CMR active ingredients, and the abbreviation of CMR stands for carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic. So these are active ingredients that are likely to cause cancer in humans. They damage the genetic material, mutagenic, or they are or they might harm the unborn child. what were the main findings of our research? So according to these categories, European Union and WHO, we identified the different active ingredients that were either developed or brought to market by either Bayer or BASF. And we found out that there are at least 22 active ingredients according to WHO 1A and 1B class that were developed or brought to market by Bayer, and 3 by BASF. And we did the same exercise concerning this categorization by the European Union. And we found out that at least 4 active ingredients, according to this classification by European Union 1B, were originally developed or brought to market by Bayer, and another 4 by BASF. And among those 8 active ingredients in total, there is an active ingredient such as glufosinate. Many people are maybe familiar with. This study also contains cases from Brazil, from Mexico, and also from South Africa. And I would like to highlight a few aspects concerning our main findings of this South African case study. South Africa is important for the entire region here at the African continent. And in many circumstances, South Africa serves as a role model. And South Africa is one of the most important markets and hubs on the African continent for the international agribusiness. And as you can see here, the numbers and the figures in recent years, the number of pesticides and active ingredients that were either imported to South Africa, as well as the numbers exported from South Africa to neighboring countries, they have dramatically increased. Between 2008 and 2018, the imports grew from around 37,000 tons to 74,000 tons, and export from around 23,000 tons to 45,000 tons. There is an extreme lack of transparency when it comes to the South African pesticide market. So for example, there is no public register that lists information on all the pesticide products and active ingredients that are registered in the country. So you have to do a lot of digging when you want to find out more about how the entire market is structured. And the agrochemical companies, they benefit from, let's say, a relatively lax approval process in South Africa. I don't know what is the situation in Kenya, but I would like to know more, because the reality in South Africa is that many of the approved pesticide products, they have not been re-examined for many, many years. And I would even claim that if they were subjected to today's stricter risk assessment standards, I'm sure many of these active ingredients and pesticide products that are at least approved and authorized in South Africa, they would be banned according to, let's say, more recent standards. And this has fatal consequences for the entire regions, because many neighboring countries, they take their cues from the approval decisions made in South Africa. And then in our research, we found that there are at least 16 active ingredients from Bayer and BASF on the South African market that are characterized by being highly hazardous to human health, according to WHO and this European Union classification. I'm almost coming to an end, maybe 2 more minutes. So what does it mean? I mean, on the one hand, you know, it's quite interesting to talk about figures, to talk about the entire application process, but all of it has impacts on the ground. And it's usually, it's farm workers and it's small-scale food producers. They are working with these pesticides and they have to apply these pesticides. And it's quite interesting because it's already a very much marginalized groups of people, and they are the ones the most hardest hit by the negative impacts of these highly hazardous products. So we did interviews. We conducted interviews with organizations and people working in the wine industry and in the citrus sector in South Africa. And I would like to know more about the situation in Kenya, but to be honest, I'm quite sure it's pretty much the same, that that there is not such a thing as proper PPE, personal protective equipment. I assume it will also be limited in Kenya. In South Africa, we found out that it's mainly the seasonal workers. They have to work with pesticides, and they do not have any masks. They do not have any gloves. They do not have any boots. They do not have any protective clothes as such, and so they are just working in ordinary clothes, and they are also even taking them home and washing them with the laundry of the rest of the family. Then exposure to pesticides, again, in the wine industry in South Africa, it's not just seasonal workers, it's also very often women farm workers, and they're even compelled by the farmers to immediately return to the vineyard after the vineyard has been sprayed. Or they even have to stay and remain in the vineyard while someone else is spraying the vineyard. The workers, they use bare hands to handle grapes and vineyards that are still wet with pesticides when people work in the vineyards again. There is the proximity of workers' home to plantations. Usually the space between the houses where the workers live and the plantation is very often, it's less than 10 meters. So it's a very general situation that in many of the farms, and when farmers spray the pesticides, they obviously drift into the homes through open windows, open doors. Children are playing outside, so they also inhale the pesticides. The washing is hanging on the lines, etc. Inspections, insufficient. It's in many circumstances, it's clear there are inspections, yes, but it is rather a question how to implement these inspections. And in the South African case, in wine as well as in citrus, is that very often the farmers, they get notified in advance before an inspection is going to take place. So all of a sudden there is PPE available. All of a sudden there are toilets in the vineyards. But the next day after the inspection, everything has gone in, again, and it's not available anymore. So I think I could go for another few hours talking about the impacts, but this is, from my perspective, not just a reality in South Africa. It's a reality in many countries of the global South, and when approving certain pesticides, I think one has to take into consideration that the realities on the ground differ very much from what you can nicely put on a label, and in many circumstances people don't even read what is written on the label because they can't read, for instance, or their mother tongue or their first language is a different one than the one used on the label. Then maybe one or two more political recommendations. And again, this is also very much from a European or German perspective. Let me do one more remark. The entire international market with highly hazardous pesticides or pesticides in general is highly unregulated. Maybe only about 3% of the entire trade are regulated as such, in a binding manner, so to say. And the rest are maybe national standards, it's maybe regulations, it's very often voluntary commitments, and they are either adhered to or not. And because as a rule, there are usually no sanctions at all, and usually, it's very often the private sector. They would say, okay, come on, let's have a multi-stakeholder initiative, and then we sit together, we identify the problems. So whenever companies, from my perspective, would like to avoid a proper binding regulation, they would always propose to set up a multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's always, from my perspective, very much a waste of time. Anyway, let's get back to recommendations. From this European or German perspective, what we need is, on the one hand, we need to have more transparency, transparency surrounding the global trade in pesticide active ingredients, because it's, as it is at the moment, it's absolutely insufficient, and it must improve. All too often, corporations, they hide behind the notion of trade secrecy. I think that's the term they like most. And there are examples, for instance, in Brazil, where there is much more transparency, where you can read on the label, so on the label it must read on which company manufactured the active ingredient used and where they sourced the materials. And this shows, I mean, transparency as such in general is possible, and it's rather a question of political will. In the second step, we need to ban the export of pesticides and also active ingredients, for sure, that are prohibited in the European Union. Whether in their pure form or as a component of pesticide products, active ingredients which are either banned in the European Union or classified as highly hazardous by the WHO or these European Union categories, they should not be allowed to be traded by companies operating in Germany or in the European Union. This is really important because I don't know the case for sure in Kenya, but I assume a lot of active ingredients they need to get imported to Kenya, and then maybe the planning might take place in Kenya. But this situation is very much true in many circumstances. For instance, in South Africa, none of the active ingredients are manufactured in South Africa. 100% need to get imported. And if there is a ban on these highly hazardous pesticides, it's really difficult without manufacturing them in your own country, that you can also plant them and sell these very toxic products. And as a third step, and maybe some years in the future from now, but the movement is growing, but one needs to have illusion, and I mean this in a very positive manner. We need to have a global ban on the production, storage, and trade of highly hazardous pesticides. So we need to have international regulation of global trade in pesticide products and active ingredients. It should be tightened. And maybe I'll leave it with this, because I'm sure I took longer than 15 minutes, and I'm sorry for taking too long.
Okay. Don't
but
worry.
I was not the only one taking longer than 15 minutes, so that's all from my side. I'm looking forward for the discussion, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. Clearly very passionate about this topic and the findings of those studies. Thank you so much. We are going to go into Q&A and discussion now. Dr. Ngaruiya, if you are still with us, please could I just ask you to turn on your video if the internet allows. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions coming through. I think just one of the main takeouts from Jan's presentation is that it really is the role of the government regulator in any country is hugely important, seeing as we cannot rely on private companies to take care of human rights and environmental and protecting our environment, which is clear from the two German companies and their trade, Bayer and BASF, on the continent. And so, Dr. Ngaruiya, there are a few questions that have come through for you on the chat. So I would just read them out. And then if one of your colleagues wants to respond, if they could just raise their hand, and then I can just allow them to speak as well. So one of the first questions coming through is, in the requirement to have a certificate of registration from a country of origin, does that mean that the producer exporting a pesticide have to have a registration of this pesticide in that country of origin? A second question for Dr. Ngaruiya was, where is information that a product is not safe derived from? Okay, so given that we're putting a lot of emphasis on how to use pesticide safely, where is information coming that it's not safe to be used? There is also a question on the status of the circulars. There were 2 circulars issued by the PCPB last year, which were considering the withdrawal of chlorothalonil and also diuron. There has been some concern, particularly around chlorothalonil, because the last time it was allowed to be used in the European Union was last year in May. So maybe just an update on those circulars. And then there is a question also asking around avocado farmers through their lobby group, the Avocado Society of Kenya, complained about a slow process of approval of pesticides by the PCPB, was taking up to 3 years for inspection and trial of new chemicals. So the question is twofold. 1, please tell us the number of years it would take now for inspections and trial of new chemicals. And 2, as at 2019, 5 products had been approved for avocado farming. Could you tell us the number of products currently approved? So let me, and then there's one more question around counterfeits. So we wish to hear how Kenya is handling counterfeits. And that's from Dr. Newell. Yes. So may I hand over to you, Dr. Ngaruiya?
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. Let me start with the first one about the certificate of registration in a country of origin. This is a requirement that was introduced because we realized that there were a number of applications that were coming into the country where products were not approved for use. And therefore, in order to tighten our registration system, it became a requirement that for a product to be approved, then there is need at least to provide evidence that that product is registered for use in the country of origin. So that is one. Then number 2, there are situations where such a product may not be registered because of some good reasons. Like for instance, there could be a pest of interest in Kenya, which is not common in the country of origin. So it's still flexible a bit where even if a product is not registered for use in that country, evidence can be provided that the product is registered, for instance, in the European Union, or maybe by US EPA, or yeah.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Dr. Ngaruiya.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. So you're just saying that there is some flexibility, even if a product is not registered in another country, seeing as there might be a pest that's unique to our context.
Yes, correct. There is that flexibility. But if a product is not registered in a country of origin, there has to be justification. System, like for instance, the European Union, US EPA, Canada, Australia, or similar other countries. Then the next question was about safe products and unsafe products. And I think in our presentations, we have appreciated that pesticides are generally
Dr. Ngaruiya,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, we can. Sorry, you keep breaking up. We keep losing you, but you're back again.
Oh, sorry, maybe it's the internet problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was talking about safety of products, and I said that all pesticides are recognized to be toxic, and that is why we have the very highly toxic ones classified in WHO class 1, A or B, then the 2, 3, and the 4, but all of them generally are toxic. What differs is the level of toxicity. But there's a in Kenya, we had this recent attack by desert locusts. When we look at all the tools that a farmer may have to manage desert locusts, like the innovation that we had, practically there was none other than the pesticides. So despite the fact that they may have some negative effects, we have to weigh the benefit versus the negative effects and then make a decision. Then we as regulators know that when it comes to issues of safety, it is a dose of a pesticide that determines a poison. And I know all people who have done regulatory work are aware about look at the amount of the product that is going to be applied on a crop or the exposure to human. If the amount is negligible, even if the property of the product indicates that it is toxic, there are chances that with the mitigation measures, such a product can be used safely, but with the protective gear and also under the conditions indicated on the label. So that's the way we look at it, and noting that for a product to be able to kill effect somehow. So we need to ask ourselves whether indeed we require pesticides or not, and if we are to manage the high incidences of pests that we have in this region. So I leave it maybe for further discussion. Then the other question is about the status of the circulars that we issued. Yes, indeed, PCPB reviewed two molecules, a number of molecules actually. Two of them have been mentioned, chlorothalonil and diuron. And we notified the owners of the products to submit data to demonstrate their safety and also to update their dossiers. And we have given them timelines. The next step is to evaluate that data. Then use may be allowed. If there is evidence that by using the products, we may have some adverse effects, serious adverse effects, then some decisions will be made, which can be restricting the products or maybe withdrawing the use of such products in this country. Then the other question is from the Avocado Society of Kenya, talking about the slow process of evaluation. We need to understand that for all new products to be registered, we have to have efficacy trial data generated locally for a minimum of 3 successful trials, 3 seasons. Now for avocados, if you look at a trial maybe targeting a certain disease, we have to wait for the maybe avocado to flower so that efficacy trials can be done. We have to wait until the target pest is there for us to apply. And therefore, that could be the reason why sometimes it takes a bit of time to get consistent data that can be used for decision making. Now, we actually targeted avocados as one of the priority crops, and we have been fast-tracking registration of products for avocados. And this is in response to a request that was made by the Avocados Society of Kenya, where they requested specifically to have a number of products allowed for use in avocados. And to address this, we recently had a copper-based fungicide that was approved for use in avocados. I may not recall all others that are registered, but I'm aware that recently we had one product based on copper, which was approved for use on avocados. Then what we are doing about counterfeits. Counterfeits are a problem all over the world, not just in Kenya. But here we can say that we really do not have a lot of problems of counterfeit pesticides. Way back in the year 2009, we had a miscellaneous amendment that we did on our law that enhanced the penalties associated with offenses related to counterfeiting or adulterating pesticides. And we are very happy that the Attorney General's office was very supportive, and therefore the penalties have been enhanced so that if anybody is found manufacturing or handling a counterfeit pesticide, then the penalties are comparatively higher than all other offenses. Then we are also working very closely with other agencies. The government set up a multi-institutional agency team, that is looking at all issues to do with counterfeit products. Could be industrial products, could be pesticides, and we are working very well under that team, where we have the DCI team. We also have Kenya Bureau of Standards in the same team. We have the police, we have our people, we have the Pharmacy and Poisons Board. So together, anytime we find any product that is substandard, we work very closely together to identify the matter and then deal with it conclusively. I think that those are the questions that were asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ngaruiya. There's just, I think, one more concern that's really coming up, which is the fact is, you know, especially as we look in the context of this petition and as we move forward, but that mitigation measures aren't possible in Kenya. And this is what, you know, we hear, and this is really the worry. This is the evidence that's coming through from studies we've done in different counties and also from, you know, other countries on the continent. And so, you know, do you really believe that it's ever going to be possible to effectively protect all farmers and consumers? Because we know that we can't do buffer zones, and we know that farmers can't afford PPE. And how are we going to manage this situation?
Well, thank you, Laura. I think what is important is to start from somewhere. If we appreciate the fact that, number one, do we need to use pesticides to manage pests in Kenya? If the answer is yes, then the next step is, how do we all work together to use the pesticides safely? If you look at the products that are used in large-scale farms, like for instance, in the flower farms or large-scale vegetable farms, for sure, they put on adequate protective gear. I know for sure when it comes to the rates of applications, they really observe what is provided for on the label. It is possible that a few of our small-scale farmers may not have adequate information with regards to how to protect themselves. And probably what we can do is to work very closely together so that we can educate our farmers who we really need to ensure food security. If we have to have enough food in this country, then we have to have the small-scale farmers still being involved in agricultural production. So if we can work together so that we sensitize the growers out there, they need to protect themselves as they apply pesticides, they need to protect the environment, they need also to apply the products as per the label instructions, then we'll go a long way. I think that's the way I see it. Now, in terms of pollinators, I think there was a mention earlier on that we have not been protecting pollinators, and we require local species in terms of trials. We have actually internalized this matter some time back, and we have realized that sometimes it is not necessary to have local data. And I want to give you an example. Some years back, we had a study that was commissioned between the Netherlands, and we had a team from Brazil where we were looking at pollinators that are used as test species with regard to bees. So we had the African honeybee, we had the European honeybee, and the Brazilian one. And when we looked at the sensitivity of the three species, we actually realized in our study that it did not matter whether you are using the African honeybee or the European Union. All of them, if you use the European one, it was still sensitive enough to extrapolate to what is happening here in the pollinators in Africa. So I would hesitate really to go for very specific studies all the time whenever an application is submitted for consideration here in Kenya. Thank you.
Okay. I want to hand over, there's a question for Jan and also one for Silke. So Jan, one of the questions that have come through is really what's the level of awareness on the toxic pesticide situation in South Africa, would you say, amongst farmers or users and consumers? And what actions, if any, have been taken to address increasing import numbers and use at farmer level? And have there been any similar advocacy initiatives similar to that of the one that's happened in Kenya through the National Parliament's petition?
Thank you for the question. And for the sake of time, let me try to be brief. There is a group of people representing farm workers, representing organic farmers, but also representing like bigger sort of farm enterprises. And they're more and more aware of this problem of highly hazardous pesticides. And this initiative, as a civil society initiative, only started recently, only a couple of months ago. And they're still in the process of, so to say, developing their strategy, how they're going to tackle the most pressing, the most important issues. But yes, there is some improvement and some movement from civil society, and from my perspective, there's also a certain degree of openness from the authorities to at least to interact and listen to the criticism and see what one can do. My feeling is that in other parts of the world, for instance, in Latin America, the movements are a little bit, stronger than maybe at the African continent and put more pressure on decision makers. That was the question, right? Or did I forget anything?
Yes.
No.
No, you've done it. So I think, and I think what was also interesting to this question is that there have been issues raised specifically through the Women on Farms project in South Africa, and it didn't actually go through the pesticides regulator in South Africa, but rather went through the Department of Labor. So some concerns have been filed. There has been a submission with the Department of Labor to really how we can protect seasonal workers, majority of whom are women, on the wine farms and in the orchards in specifically in the Western Cape. So that has been a different approach to raising this issue of harmful pesticides with in the respective countries. And Silke, so there's just a question that's come through to you, and then I'm going to invite Margaret, who's also from the PCPB, just to respond to a final question, and then we'll close. So Silke, it's a question coming from João Portela from Brazil. Excuse my poor pronunciation. It's really saying, in Brazil, we have a vast variety of experiences demonstrating that it is definitely technically possible, environmentally friendly, socioeconomically fair, and very profitable to produce on an agroecological and sustainable agriculture basis. Is this a reality in Kenya? Is there an agroecology movement, giving the example of how we could produce in a tropical context without pesticides? And what is the relevance of agroecology in Kenya? So
I'm not sure if I'm the right. So
maybe your views, and then I'm happy to hand over to PCPB as well to give their input on the same question.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a huge drive in Kenya on organic farming and demand on organic products. And there's also quite a drive on agroecological farming. Policy-wise, it's sort of like hinking behind, I would say. But there is a movement, let's put it like that. It could be more. But there is a movement, and the registration of biopesticides, as we heard in the first presentation, is also a very good regulation and registration. But again, it's for many farmers it's too slow. They're waiting for a long time for the registration of biopesticides, which you need if you convert your farm from conventional to organic. So it's definitely possible. And many farmers doing it already. It's not a question of going from one conversion from one farm to the other in like a day. It takes a long time. And it also needs to take into consideration that there are many pests, and there are pests which are maybe not necessarily are in other countries, but many farmers and even large scale farmers are actually able to do that. So yeah.
Okay. And then Margaret, are you with us? Margaret is she's a compliance manager at the Pest Control Products Board. So I've just, Margaret, can you talk? Can you try and, can you let me know if you can talk and we can hear you? I've tried to allow you to talk so you could respond to this question, but we seem to have lost you. Okay, not to worry. Dr. Ngaruiya, I might hand it over to you then, please. There's just one last question, which is really looking at the relationship between government and pesticides companies. And really is PCPB allied to pesticides companies? And how proactive on pesticides liberation would you say that the PCPB is? And this is another question coming from Brazil.
Yeah, thank you, Rona, for the question. Maybe before I answer the last question, let me say something about whether we can grow crops in Kenya without pesticides. And if you look at it from a general point of view, if it's a commercial production, my answer is no. It is not possible to produce any crops in Kenya without use of pesticides. But I want to qualify that statement that by the word pesticide, the way we interpret it here, we are including biopesticides and the conventional chemicals. And also the ordinary methods in terms of pesticide application, whether it is biopesticides or of the conventional chemicals. All of them are management options. But in the first instance, we recommend that before any application is fine. Then because of recognition of the importance of biopesticides, I mentioned we already have regulations in place. That is why no wonder we have companies here in Kenya that produce phytoceras. We also have others that produce brachias. We have products based on pyrethrum. We have products based on neem. And we have the semiochemicals that are used either to attract or repel insects. So indeed, we recognize the importance of IPM, but not lack of use of pesticides. Then the relationship between government and the pesticide companies. I would say that the main stakeholder when it comes to pesticide manufacture are the agrochemical companies. And of course, we have the farmers themselves, we have the researchers who are also key stakeholders. So we consider the agrochemical companies to be key stakeholders, just like the way we consider all other stakeholders. And I've mentioned we have the agricultural extension officers, we have the researchers who do efficacy trials for us. Then we have, of course, the policymakers. So indeed, yes, they are key stakeholders. And our current policy requirements are that whenever you are to make decisions involving key stakeholders, there is every need to involve parties that are going to be affected by any decision that one is going to make. So that is why in a number of occasions, we try to engage the stakeholders whenever a key decision is going to be made. I don't know whether Margaret is back. I could see she was trying to talk. I don't know whether she.
Yeah, you can just unmute Margaret and then you would be able to contribute. There we go.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. It was refusing to respond to unmute, but my mic got hidden. I don't know what happened. So
okay.
maybe I can extend the comment that Dr. Ngaruiya was discussing, that the industry is also a key stakeholder in our work, in the sense that they also have stewardship activities.
Margaret, we've lost you.
properly, in which case we do conduct safe use trainings for the industry. So that's another area where there are key stakeholders. And they also have a code of conduct that the members follow. And in that code, they also they focus a lot on the industry complying with the national laws, which now helps us in the regulation work, that they are willing to follow the law and they monitor one another in following the law in a number of areas, from registration, kind of the whole life cycle concerning pesticides. And somebody had asked a question on the trainings that we do conduct targeting farmers. So that's one area we also work together with the industry in holding those activities, and also in training agro-dealers also another area that we collaborate a lot with the industry, and it helps in the regulation work, in the sense that those who are selling through the agro-dealers support them in the knowledge that they are supposed to have, and also trainings so that they are able to conduct their business according to the law.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Okay, guys, so I'm going to close this webinar now, please, because we are 20 minutes over time, but I think important discussions, because this is an important issue, because every one of us has a right to safe food and to know what is going on. So if you would like to find out more about the Root to Food initiative, feel free to look at our website, which is www.roottofood.org. We are available also for questions. I will just put the email address in the chat. And this is our website. Yeah, so with that, I would really like to say thank you very much to all our panelists and presenters for the time. And yeah, next week we'll be doing our final webinar, which is looking at alternatives to pesticides, so expanding a little bit more on IPM, which Dr. Ngaruiya spoke about, and also the concept of agroecology. Yes, so thank you very much all for attending, and we will share the recording, and also the presentations we won't share publicly, but if you want them specifically, please feel free to email us, and the recording will be shared with you tomorrow. Thank you so much. All right, bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Ngaruiya.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Bye. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for joining us.